an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering The Ambassador's Mission, the Traitor's Spy Trilogy, Book 1, Chapters 1, 2, and 3, The Old and the New, Questionable Connections, and Safe Places, Dangerous Destinations. In these chapters, so we just got finished covering the book that takes place long before this period. And I find myself so comforted coming back into the timeline that I started with. Interesting. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. Thank you very much, first of all, to Ashleigh for commissioning this episode. I am really surprised at how ready I am to go back to the Curalia and everything that I am familiar with. I didn't really expect to feel this way when I had I think Martin told me last time I covered and was asking what the next book in the series was. I think he mentioned that it was actually took place after the original Black Magician trilogy, which I didn't really expect. I thought the next book was going to be taking place maybe a few years after the Magician's Apprentice, and that we would get to see the formation of the guild and everything. But when he told me that, I was kind of oh, okay, I guess. I kind of wanted to see more of this history. But now that we're back in Curalia with Sonea, with Sari, I feel like there is a real difference in the way the world feels in this series versus The Magician's Apprentice. There is something that is more fleshed out to me. I'm not sure if that's because she's already had 3 books to establish things, if it's because she is just more familiar with these characters and is more comfortable writing them, or if it's the fact that we've got a little bit more perspective going on here, because in The Magician's Apprentice, we've got Tessia and Jayan, who are kind of 2 halves of the same coin, or 2 sides of the same coin, right? They're both apprentices. They're both she isn't as privileged as Jayan, coming from, a family that was essentially commoners, but she was still doing pretty well. Her family was doing pretty well. And other than that, we have Hanara, who is a slave, but is in a weird position because of being a slave, where he's still very much in the world of the privileged. And then we've got Dakin occasionally, and I feel that's pretty much, and Stara, right? So we've got a lot of people who are either very privileged or exist in the world of the privileged. And I think that I was kind of missing this, this commoner perspective, because Hanara isn't, he isn't a commoner because he's a slave, so that puts him at an even lower level. And he isn't, he doesn't have the freedom to go do what he wants. So there is a piece of the puzzle of the regular person living in Curalia or in Sochaka, where I feel I didn't get a good look at what people thought of this world. And when we come back into this timeline, which I think is 20 years on from the end of the last Black Magician trilogy book, there is just a real sense of place to it. There is, I think partially because of starting off with Sari's perspective, there's a real feeling of like the magicians aren't the only people who exist, you know, which I think was a little bit lacking in Magician's Apprentice. It was so magician focused, and I really enjoy seeing what people who are not magicians think of them, how they interpret the actions taken by these people. I don't know. I am really here for this already. And I'm interested to see if I continue to feel this way, because it's sort of a funny line that we're dancing on, where we've got a bunch of people that we're familiar with, and then we've got a couple of new players who have entered the equation, who are the children of Sari, the child of Sonea. And also we have like relationships that have changed. I mean, it's just a very, I feel like this is going to be pretty interesting. Oftentimes, jumping way ahead in time to the point where people's kids have grown up can be almost tiresome. Like, it feels like the author just didn't really feel like putting in the time. And so they wanted us to they wanted the ease of writing a full grown adult character. But at the same time, I don't like reading stories about children a lot of the time, unless they are for children. I don't like reading like adults' interpretations of or adults writing children a lot of the time, like within an adult story. So I am very, very here for this, as I said. So let's start off. Chapter 1, The Old and the New. We have this moment of Sari, who is like walking alone on the street, and some guy pops out and tries to mug him. And Sari kills him. Like, just boom. That's it. A click, a snap of sleeve, and the robber gasped and sank to his knees. A knife clattered to the ground. The man patted him on the shoulder. Sorry, wrong night, wrong target, and I don't have time to explain why. And at this point, Sari's like, Goal, where are you? Because Goal is supposed to be like keeping an eye out. And Sari had to take care of this himself. And it turns out that there is somebody out here targeting thieves. And for those who don't remember, there is a guild specifically that is kind of like, it's one of those things where everybody tries to sort of like work together in general, but really they're just working together against the guards of the city. They're not really allied with each other the way that, like, you know, one would wish they were. And there have just been a lot of thieves turning up dead, which is kind of surprising considering that all of them have like kind of intricate systems of trusted people that are between them and the public, ways of getting around that often don't even involve being on the street, homes that are protected, and it is really starting to get a little alarming for all of them. Over half of them had died over the past few years, each in different ways and most from unnatural causes: stabbed, poisoned, pushed from a tall building, burned in a fire, drowned or crushed in a collapsed tunnel. Some said a single person was responsible, a vigilante they called the thief hunter. Others believed it was the thieves themselves settling old disputes. Goal said it wasn't who would go next that punters were betting on, but how. So this is really interesting. Like, last trilogy, there had been somebody who was just targeting regular people, and it kind of was all over the place who they were going after, but it was the method of the killing that always was the same. Now we've got all of the people are a similar type of person, but the method is always different, which feels like somebody who's much more of an opportunist. And also, I could see this being somebody who's like, I'm going to give you like a kind of half-baked theory here. The thieves are looked down on. I mean, the lower classes are looked down on by magicians in particular. The thieves are looked down on as well by the upper classes more, I feel like. I think that there's something to be said for the way the thieves coexist with regular folks, that they offer some kind of protection at times as well. That to me points to, it's not a lower class that has done this. It is somebody from upstairs. And I feel like even though none of the ways these people have died have looked magical, I still think it's a magician. And considering that there has really been some tension between the classes recently, I could definitely see this being as like somebody who thinks that they're like doing everybody a favor by getting rid of a subsection of folk who are dedicating their lives to crime, essentially. Now, again, do I have any like real evidence for this? No, I admit. But based on where we're going in the first chapters of this book and the way that people are talking about one another and their loyalties and whatnot, that just kind of feels like where we're heading, you know? So there is, the thieves like just don't cooperate with each other the way that they had used to. So Sari's like thinking about how they could have like at one time called a meeting and kind of figured out a way to protect one another and keep an eye out. But he doesn't feel like they're in the position to cooperate the way that they had been, that nobody's like willing, the trust isn't there that had been, which is interesting because he's thinking this to himself before he gets called to a meeting by somebody who is asking him to cooperate. So it seems like he's not the only one thinking in this direction. So he is, let's see, as Sari waited, he looked down at a red line painted across the alley entrance and smiled with amusement. Having declared the slums a part of the city, the king had tried to take control of it with varying success. Improvements to some areas led to raised rents, which along with demolition of unsafe houses, forced the poor into smaller and smaller areas of the city. They dug in and made these places their own, and like cornered animals, defended them with savage determination, giving their neighborhoods names like Black Streets and Dwellfort. There were now boundary lines, some painted, some only known by reputation, over which no city guard dared step unless he was in the company of several colleagues, and even then they might expect a fight. Only the presence of a magician ensured their safety. So, we've got some gentrification happening here. And this is the kind of thing, I don't know how many of you are like me, kind of ignorant about it. I know the general idea. Gentrification is something that occurs when an area that had previously been for those who were like lower income and was affordable begins to be, quote, improved. And when that happens, the value of the properties go up and people get priced out of their own homes. Oftentimes, they're offered money to leave their homes so that those places can be remodeled and rented out or sold at a higher, way higher price point than what that person had originally been paying. Now, like for those of you who have listened to other shows of mine, a while back I covered Daredevil, and there is a character there who's being offered money to leave, and she is digging in her heels and doesn't want to leave. She's an old woman who has lived there her whole life. And they are putting pressure on her to move by like making it less and less livable in her home. And at the time when I was covering it, I was kind of like, I don't understand. They're offering her like a decent amount of money to leave. Just take the money. Like it's not worth it, you know? And while as somebody who is often struggled with money, I still feel that way, like in terms of how I would handle somebody doing this to me. I now understand a little bit better how incredibly predatory our housing system is. And there is this sort of assumption that we all make that like, yeah, well, if the place is nicer to live, then it should cost more to live there. And I want to come back at folks with why. We just accept that even if people who have been paying a certain amount their entire lives and have themselves done nothing to warrant their rents being raised or, homes being like purchased out from under them, we just accept that the cost of living should be on par with whatever improvements are happening around them. And that's like a product of capitalism, right? This is a product of us being like, well, sure, the folks who own the properties can charge what they want because they are the owner and that's up to them. And I have really started to come around on the idea that landlords who charge as high a rent as they can get for an area are an enormous part of the problem. And if that weren't happening, a lot of areas, I believe, would be healthier. And there wouldn't be this like mass exodus to smaller and smaller affordable areas that are then riddled with crime because people who are forced to live in those areas are often struggling. And it's just gentrification is just one of those things that when you come from a position of privilege and you take for granted the way the market works, you don't see the problem. You're like, yeah, well, I mean, that's going to happen. And that's definitely how I was for a long time. And recently I've just started to be like, wow, that's really gross. We really just don't want poor people living anywhere near nice things. We just don't like the idea of sharing our space with people that we have deemed to not be the type we want around, whether that mean, a certain religion, a certain race, a certain like class of person. And it is the kind of problem that because it is so normalized that this happens, it's all the more insidious and difficult to convince people of what a problem it is. It's something that I think is handled really subtly and well. I haven't watched the next seasons of Insecure, but she's getting priced out of her apartment that she's lived in for years. And there are a ton of white people suddenly moving into an area that had been primarily black, and all of a sudden she can't live there anymore. And all of these like really high-end businesses that are just, mayonnaise stores and shit start moving in. And that is how it happens. And it's not accidental that gentrification often means an enormous shift in the racial makeup of a neighborhood. That's how that works. So that obviously isn't necessarily a component here because it's not like in these stories, we've got a really strong delineation between the races and where they live. There aren't Sechakans out here living in Karelia, really. There's a few, and they stand out a lot. And at the moment, they aren't going to want to live out there because Karelia and them just got done with a war, and it's going to be like probably pretty unpleasant for them. So that's not the factor here. It's classism, and that is something that you can often, when the classes are this divided, you can tell at a glance which class somebody belongs to, or at least the general area of higher or lower. Martin's here. Hi, Martin. So yeah, this is an interesting thing. Like the purge has been ended and they are not forced out of the city, but because of the way profit works and owning property works, there's still a problem with the poor being forced to the outer edges of things anyway. It's still like they figured out essentially a way to create the purge using the market rather than actual force. And that, to me, that's the dangerous thing. When we try and behave as if the market is this like force that is somehow, we love to pretend that it's objective, which is just insane. Like, there is no way a force that is motivated and moved by profit and money can ever be objective. That's like inherently wrong and impossible. But, we love to pretend that that is true. So this idea that like, oh yeah, we're not forcing them to move. We're not getting guards in there and picking everybody up by their arms and carrying them to the outer edges of the city. We're not doing that anymore. It's civilized now. No, maybe you're not. But these people literally cannot afford to like own a home or rent anywhere. You're accomplishing the same thing. It's like sharecropping after slavery was ended. It's the same thing. We're just going to make it look a little bit more polite. But in the end, it's accomplishing the same thing and controlled by the same people. So, yeah, you're full of shit. Okay. So anyway, dwelled too long on that. I'm sorry. I just find this interesting, the way that things have like moved after, because I had said at the end of the last book with Sonea's like wanting to end the purge and accomplishing that and feeling like this was presented as a real sort of like happy ending. And I expressed some skepticism on that. And I feel like that is borne out here. And I really appreciate that Canavan is just like, yeah, no, we have people and they are still having like, they still have the same prejudices against one another and the same greed. And we're going to show you what would actually happen. So let's see, there was a new thoroughfare cutting through the bad part of the city known as Wild Ways. Sari had wondered at first why the king had bothered. Anyone traveling along it was at risk of being robbed by the denizens on either side, and probably stuck with a knife in the process. But the road was wide, giving little cover for muggers, and the tunnels beneath, once part of the underground network known as Thieves' Road, had been filled in during its construction. Many of the old, overcrowded buildings on either side had been demolished and replaced by large, secure ones owned by merchants. Split in two, vital connections within Wild Ways had been broken. Though Sari was sure efforts were underway to dig new tunnels, half the local population had been forced into other bad neighborhoods, while the rest were split by the main road. Wild Ways, where visitors had once come seeking a gambling house or a cheap whore, undeterred by the risk of robbery and murder, was doomed. So, yeah, he is... We're in the middle of talking things over, him and Goal discussing the fact that somebody just tried to mug him. Do they think that this guy was there to test him on behalf of whomever is committing all of these murders? And they get stopped by a couple of guards, and they ask, like, where he's heading. And Sari says, a meeting with the king. And this is something that he'd been told to say. And when he says this, the guards immediately change their whole vibe. Like, they both sort of straighten up, back away, and get respectful all of a sudden. And he's meeting this person at what is sort of like a new garden. There's a home that was destroyed by the war. And rather than rebuild it, this person, like, basically moved into the basement and then left the surface area open and began to garden and make it someplace that people could meet. And it turns out to be rather useful because there's not anywhere for someone to hide. So they don't worry about getting ambushed or overheard. And I think that's a really interesting idea. I rather like this. It's like meeting in the park, you know? So we hear finally about the man who he, I believe, referred to when he said meeting the king, named Skellen. And Skellen is supposed to be extremely ruthless, intelligent, and that he just doesn't really compromise on anything. And Sari has heard a lot of stories about the way that he operates, but he's not entirely sure what's true and what has been embellished over time. And there's also an interesting thing. Skellen is not the name of an animal. And all the thieves, there's been a tradition of them taking the name of an animal. And he has been the first to break with that tradition. And there are some folks who think that Skellen is actually his real name. And they respect him for being brave enough to just tell everybody. And then there are a lot of people who are like, no, he just made up a name. Stop being an idiot. So I find Skellen really interesting right out of the gate. And I want to know more about this person. So then we have a mention of Sonea. And he says, They had learned to distract the city's do-gooders from their failure to deal with the problem with donations to their pet charity projects, which included the hospices run by Sonea, still a hero to the poor, even if the rich only spoke of Acheron's efforts and sacrifices in the Achani invasion. Sari often wondered if she guessed how much of the money donated to her cause came from corrupt sources, and if she did she care? Which, it's interesting to me that she's running hospices. Is that a different meaning in this world? Because I'm wondering if that's hospital, like their word for hospital. Because, like, a hospice is where people go to die, essentially. Is that what that means? Or is it hospital and they're just using a different word for it? But anyway, so he meets up with this guy, Skellen, who is definitely foreign. He has dark skin, but it isn't like the deep Lonmar color. It's like a reddish, which makes me think that maybe he's like a mix between a Lonmar and a Sachakin. And he doesn't have an accent or anything. Like, seems like he's clearly from around here. And he wants to talk privately. So they send their bodyguards away. And this is when he says, I really think that the thieves should work together a little bit more. I don't love the fact that we're all our separate little factions and that we don't know how to cooperate. And Sari, he asks Sari what he thinks, and Sari's cautious and says something about, like, you win some, you lose some. And Skellen's like, okay, are there pros to not working together that I don't know about? And Sari says, well, I haven't had much good come from it, but I still have a few understandings with other thieves. So at this point, he's like, listen, I want to get as much information gathered about the thief killer as possible. And Sari is like kind of dubious on the idea that there is one person doing all this. Like, he just doesn't really seem to buy it, that not just one person would be capable of killing all of these different people without being caught, but also that, like, they would do that. Each person they killed, they would do it in such a different way. But at the same time, there's nobody really looking into this. So it's better to just cooperate and see where it goes, So what do you want to do about him? I'd like your agreement that if you hear anything about the thief hunter, you'll tell me. I understand that many thieves aren't talking to each other, so I offer myself as a recipient of information about the thief hunter instead. Perhaps, with everyone's cooperation, I'll get rid of him for you all, or at the least, I'll be able to warn anyone if they're going to be attacked. To which Sari's like, that seems really nice and everything, and Skellen's like, yeah, I know, but we've got to do something. We have to figure something out. So, finally, Sari agrees. He's just kind of like, he doesn't really see the downsides of this. And then he says, I'm sure you know the main product I import and sell. So there's this new drug that it's really interesting to me that this is a factor here. It's called Roet, or Rot, as some call it. Not something I'm interested in, and I hear you have it well in hand. Skellen says, I do. When Farron died, he left me a shrinking territory. I needed a way to establish myself and strengthen my control. I tried different trades. Roet's supply was new and untested. I was amazed at how quickly Kiralians took to it. It's proven to be very profitable, and not just for me. The houses are making a nice little income from the rent on the Brazier houses. So my analogy, or my analogous product, is thinking of this as opium. Because the Brazier houses seem, like opium dens. Opium can be used to calm. It's used in a lot of medicine, and there's a mention later about people taking it and forgetting to eat or forgetting to feed their children, and feeding it to their children as well when they're like fussy. And that all seems to be like kind of within the same sort of vibe to me. And this is becoming a real problem. And later on, it's remarkable to me that it's something that the higher classes are using and being very open about. Now, it's remarkable to me mostly because not that it wasn't, opium was extremely popular amongst the higher classes, like, of course, but I didn't expect it to already be in use. I thought that this was going to be something that started with the lower classes and began to filter upward. And once we entered the story, we would be around for like one of the first usages of the drug by some of the upper class characters. But no, it has been done. And some of them already have an impression of it and whether they like it or not. And I found that to be kind of nice, that we didn't have to go through this whole song and dance of like the experience and the discovery that it can be terrible for you and whatever. That's over and done with, and people are established in whether they like it or not, which I'll talk about more later. But yeah, he says, you could be gaining from this little industry too, Sari of Northside. And Sari's just like, yeah, no. People in my territory are too poor to handle this kind of habit. And Skellen says something like, I mean, they might be, but you're doing a lot for them, and they're doing better than they were. And Sari says it would stop growing if Roet was brought in too soon and too fast. And if I could manage it, we'd have no rot at all. He'd seen what it did to men and women caught up in the pleasure of it, forgetting to eat or drink or to feed their children except to dose them with the drug to stop their complaints of hunger. But I'm not foolish enough to think I can keep it away forever. If I don't provide it, someone else will. I'll have to find a way to do so without causing too much damage. Which, that is something that I think is key here. Sari is not an idealist. He is somebody who likes to, like, think of the best case scenario and then be like, all right, well, we know that's not happening. So how can I manage to do something that's like getting me in that basic neighborhood while facing the fact that people are going to get their hands on this stuff. It's going to happen. I appreciate that a lot. Trying to just say that something isn't allowed just straight up doesn't work. You have to manage it. People want what they want. And especially something that is like a mood enhancer or a relaxant or something like this, especially when you're dealing with folks who are an oppressed group and constantly stressed because they don't have enough money, because they don't have enough food. You're not going to fight addiction to something like this. It's not going to happen. You have to manage it and create a support system for it. That's it. And I wish so much that we could just like fucking come to that conclusion as a country, but you know, it's fine. Some states are starting to in some ways. So Skellen's like, Roet is popular because it's new and fashionable, but eventually it'll be like Bull, just another vice of the city grown and prepared by anybody. I'm hoping that by then I'll have established new trades to support myself with. He paused and looked away. One of the old honorable thief trades, or perhaps even something legitimate. He turned back and smiled, but there was a hint of sadness and dissatisfaction in his expression. Perhaps there's an honest man in there, Sari thought. If he didn't expect Roe to spread so fast, maybe he didn't expect it to cause so much damage. But that isn't going to convince me to get in the trade myself. So yeah, this is just really compelling to me that maybe Skellen's doing this and he's just kind of like, I don't like it either. And frankly, I'm looking forward to the day when it's not really fashionable anymore because I want to move on to something else, but I can't just drop it now. Like it's taken on a life of its own, you know? So I you know, this conversation between the two of them, ends with Skellen bringing up Lord Acheron and Sari's connection to him. And Sari kind of tries to downplay their connection and says something about how, like, you know, I just did favors for him. It's, you know, the upper classes use us the way they feel like using us. And you have to try and get something out of it. But you're always going to be at their mercy in a way. And Skellen says, did he ever teach you magic? And Sari laughs and says, if only. And Sari later is like, he knows magic doesn't work like that. Why would he even ask me this? And I am extremely curious about this. Like, Does Skellen believe that magic can just be taught to anybody? Does he believe that everyone has the capacity for magic? Does he believe it's something that can be instilled and like given? That is a really fascinating concept, because we've got people cutting someone, putting their hand over it and drawing all of their magic out of them, or their life force and strength. What about cutting them and pouring your magic into them? Like, we never really thought about it going in the other direction, but maybe that's something. So yeah, he agrees to share this information and mentions to Goal that he asked if Acheron taught me magic. And Goal says, that isn't that odd. Farron did hide Sonea before he handed her over to the guild in the hopes that she would do magic for him. So Goal's sort of like operating with this assumption that he was just finding out whether Sari has any magic because he's trying to decide if Sari should be more of his right-hand man. And Sari is of a different opinion, where he's like, he has to know. If I had magic, I wouldn't be out here doing what I do. Why? Like, there's just something weird about the question. At this point, somebody comes up to them in an absolute panic. There's a bandage on their head. They're bleeding. And they tell Sari that Celia and the boys got past everything. Don't know how. When I came to. And Sari says someone had made it past all the locks and guards and protections and murdered his family. So, damn. Okay, I guess we're just going to start with that. Murdered his whole family. Shit. And it turns out he has an ex-wife who they butted heads too much. They were just not right for each other. But he had a daughter with her. And once they split, he made an effort to act as if he didn't give a shit about them, in an effort to make them seem like they were not targets that anybody needed to worry about. And, you know, he knows that probably his ex-wife and daughter resent him for that, but he feels like he was doing the smart thing there. And now that is the only child that he has left. So he winds up reaching out to her a little later. So chapter 2, questionable connections. So we have Sonea being visited by Sari, and he tells her the news. And, you know, he's asking her how things are going here. And she is saying, like, the rich and poor novices are squabbling because they're allowing lower classes, who we find out later they're called lowies, and the upper class folks are called snobbers, I think. Or snobbies, maybe. They are still butting heads. Like, it's nice that they're being allowed in, and that's cool, but it's not like they don't get picked on, and there isn't, like, still a very deep social trench between the two of them. And he says something about how he wishes the purge hadn't ended, and Sonea, who was instrumental in ending it, is like, are you fucking serious? Like, she really takes offense to that. He says something about how everything has changed for the worse. And she's like, oh, and that's because the purge has stopped and not because of fucking Rowett, which she sort of suspects he's involved with the distribution of it at this point. And she kind of doesn't want to know whether he is or not. There's a lot about the way Sari operates that she'd rather not know. And yeah. She, let's see, Celia had been a much better match for him. Vesta was his first wife, right? And she asks about his other daughter, Anye. And he says, you know, I'm afraid to go and see her because I don't want to lead them to her. But at the same time, I do feel the need to warn her. She can't just be taken completely unawares. So I would love it if she would just go fucking hide, really. That would be the ideal. So she sends him away, and she leaves the room so that he can get out, because she doesn't know how he gets in and out of her rooms without anybody seeing him. And she doesn't want to know about it because if somebody reads her mind later, then he won't be able to do it anymore. And she kind of enjoys being able to be in contact with him like this. So this spurs her to go and see Acheron's grave. And, we get a little bit of a recap of everything that had happened. The fact that these graves were sort of a thing that people didn't understand because they didn't know why there would be a body left since magic had used to consume a magician. And now they are coming more into fashion again. But in some ways, she doesn't think it's a good thing because people are getting so over the top with the way that they are buried that it's just ridiculous. So she, and there's, a thing with Sonea being one of the black magicians that she goes and takes the magic from magicians who are on their deathbeds before they can be consumed by it. So I would imagine if somebody dies suddenly, it is a bit of a shock. There's no way that they can stop them from imploding, I would guess. But if they are aware that this person is nearing the end of their life, then they can handle that. So, father of Lorcan had been added in small begrudging letters, but of her own name there was no mention, and will never be while your family has anything to do with it, Acheron, but at least they've accepted your son. So this is really interesting. She, being of a lower class, is not, acknowledged by them at all, and they have accepted his son, and they are apparently, his son is accepted by the rest of that social circle. But she is just separate from all of it. And I just think that that's a compelling situation. So at this point, here comes Rothan. Good old Rothan. And he says something about this is not a good time to be making the guild question their trust of a common-born magician, considering the change of rules about to be proposed. Because she disappeared and he's just nobody knew where you were, girl. And she says, I haven't left the city in 20 years and have only left the guild grounds to work in the hospices. Isn't that enough? Not for some, and certainly not for Callan. And she's yeah, well, that's Callan's job. Don't worry about him. I can handle him. He wouldn't complain about me visiting Acheron's grave. And he's well, you need to leave messages so that we know where you are. And I'm just God, what do they think she's out here doing? Murdering people and stealing their magic again? Jesus Christ. So, let's see. She's thinking about the memories of her child and what he is like. And we eventually go to Lorcan's POV. And he says something to her here that Lord Regin has offered to represent those who oppose the petition. Now, I'm failing to remember what this petition is about. Because Regin, this is her old enemy, and apparently he's grown more polite, but he's still really a snobby little shit. Let's see. Some who grew up in the slums went on to break a vow, learn forbidden magic, and defy higher magicians and kings to the degree they were forced to send her into exile is hardly going to inspire trust in lower class origin magicians. Yeah, she's not well loved, apparently. There seems to be a grudging respect, and that's about as good as it gets. So I'm trying to make sure that I cover everything because I only have 15 minutes left, and I feel like there's still a lot. Okay, yeah. Then we go to Lorcan. And I was just really pleasantly surprised with the characterization of this kid who I feel like I know pretty well already. Lorcan is out here hanging out with a bunch of friends. Decker is apparently the bold. It says he was the boldest, though that was a typical trait of most young warriors. So Decker's the Gryffindor. He just seems to be a little bit more of a troublemaker, a little bit more of a jokester, and kind of arrogant, Of the rest of the group, alchemist Sharon had always done whatever Decker suggested, but healers Reader and Orlin were not so easily led into mischief. Perhaps it was only natural for healers to be cautious. Whatever the reason, Lorcan had only agreed to accompany Decker because the pair hadn't refused to. Which is interesting. It gives you a good idea of the fact that Lorcan is cautious and doesn't really trust his own judgment. So he defers to the healers and their judgment, which I feel like really tells you something about him. They go to this place called the Tailor's Shop, which is somewhere that they meet up that is really just kind of like a common area. You know, it's like a sort of secret thing, but it's not really that secret. And there is Sharon is the one who says that they should get a brazier of rowet to relax us. And Lorcan is the first one to be like, no. And Orlin is saying no at the exact same time. And they sort of make eye contact and nod at one another. They both do not approve of this thing. And then we see they had tried it once before, and Lorcan had found the experience disturbing. It wasn't how it had brought out Decker's cruel side, so that he had teased and tormented the girl who had been besotted with him at the time, but how this behavior suddenly hadn't bothered Lorcan. In fact, he'd found it funny, but later could not understand why. The girl's infatuation had ended that day, and Sharon's love affair with Rowett had begun. Before then, Sharon would have done anything Decker had asked him. Since that day, he would only do so if it didn't come between him and Rowett. So this is really, I love this description of, it wasn't like it made me feel terrible or, fucked me up so bad. It was because when I look back at what I was like when I was on it, it's like not who I am, and I don't like remembering the way that I was. And that feels very real to me. It's so easy to just try and be like, oh, I didn't like the way it made me feel. But drugs like this don't become popular because people don't feel good when they use them. The people have to have some sort of self-awareness a lot of the time, or want to maintain a sense of control. I know for me, that's a lot of the reason why I didn't smoke weed or drink for a long time, because I'm a control freak and I didn't like the idea that I would do things that I wasn't, if I were sober, would totally not approve of. So yeah, I rather liked this side story here. And then we find out about the Lowies and Snooties. That's right. Not snobbies, snooties. That's the names for the upper and lower classes. Lorcan did not fit into either group. His mother had come from the slums, his father from one of the most powerful houses in Imardin. He had grown up in the guild, away from the political manipulations and obligations of the houses or the hard life of the slums. Most of his friends were snooties. He hadn't avoided befriending Lowies deliberately, but most Lowies, while not appearing to resent him like they did the snooties, had been hard to talk to. It was only after some years, when Lorcan had a firm circle of snooty friends, that he realized the Lowies had been intimidated by him, or rather, who his father had been. So yeah, I think that this feels like an honest look at how this would work out. It's really easy and oftentimes feels like a pleasant thing to do when somebody is sort of between classes like this, to have them be friends with the lower classes, because that signals that they're more down to earth and somehow more humble. But the truth is, it doesn't work out that way every time. And that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the person being arrogant as well and wanting to be around people who are like this. It can just be that it's more pleasant to be around people who have money. It's easier to be around people for whom all doors are always open. And if they don't actively reject you, I mean, why wouldn't you? I know, especially if his family, the Akron side of the family, is providing him with money and stuff. I had this weird thing in high school where I was there's social groups, as we all know, in high school. And I was in this strange position where I was actually lower class in terms of the money that my parents made, but I didn't have a lot of the like speech patterns and manners of people who were lower classes. I got really good grades. I was attractive. And so a lot of the upper class popular kids would like very tentatively welcome me to sit at their table and stuff. And I kind of considered being part of that crew because I liked the fact that they took school seriously and that sort of thing. But then I began to realize that hanging out with them, I was so much more aware of how broke I was. And I wound up sort of falling back into the theater kids, which had a lot of like a mixture. It was a much more like varied group. Because it didn't really matter with them what kind of money we made. And it was just more comfortable. If Lorcan doesn't have to worry about that, if he's not around these people, like, you know, unable to pay for things and constantly aware then yeah, this is going to be where he feels more at home. So we find out that, he had this like thing with this girl who shows up, Beria. It's an interesting story that I'm not sure I believe like what he thinks happened, but Beria, he's clearly like kind of still in love with her. She is a beautiful dark-haired girl, and they had spent every second together for quite a while. He was just like obsessed. It was one of those sort of youthful things where your first love is just absolutely fucking overwhelming and just consumes you. And he's like, you know, nobody like disapproves of the two of them being together. So there's nothing really like keeping them from one another. And he, finally is discovered in bed with her. And, you know, everybody kind of knew that they were probably sleeping together, but it wasn't provable. There was no like, you know, outside evidence. So as soon as they have like a witness to the fact that they're sleeping together, their families are like, all right, well, you need to fucking marry her. Like, you know, anybody else isn't going to want her because she's not a virgin anymore. And this is because apparently she is not a magician. So like magicians who are women, they can basically use magical birth control, and it's accepted that they could sleep with people. But evidently she is not, you know, it did not matter that he as a magician could prevent Beria becoming pregnant. If they did not marry, she would be regarded as spoiled to any future suitor. So he had been totally prepared to marry her, 100%. And she turns him down, and refused to see him. When he finally managed to ambush her one day, she had told him she never loved him, that she encouraged him because she had heard that magicians could make love without the danger of siring a child, that she was sorry for lying to him. I love this. Now, you know, she seems kind of terrible, but I also don't buy this story. I bet she cared about him and somebody else kept her away from him for some reason. Also, even if she is telling the truth, I kind of love that we have a girl in this story who's like, oh no, I just really wanted to fuck. And I feel like I thought you'd be the safest person to fuck because you would not be able to get me pregnant, which awesome. You know, there's so many stories where it's just the dudes who are like after sex and the girls who wind up heartbroken. And I love the fact that she's just like, oh no, sorry, buddy. I totally was not like honest with you. I just wanted to fuck. So she's still hanging out with their friends and he tries to be cool, but he's like obviously still into her. And there's another girl that kind of got interested in him and he like was sleeping with her, but then realized that he didn't care about her and dumped her. And she's like resentful. There's a lot of just messiness in the relationship. Right. So yeah, they have like the conversation goes on with, the talk about the, you know, the social structure and how things are going. Father's family hasn't attempted to find me a bride in a while now. Maybe they're starting to realize how much pleasure Mother gets from spoiling all their plans for me, though I'm sure she wouldn't block anything if I wanted it. So then we go to him going and seeing Dannyl. And I'm very, very excited because when I saw the title of this book was the Ambassador's Mission, I assumed that we were talking about Dannyl. And then as we started it, I was like suddenly worried that maybe I was wrong and Dannyl wasn't going to factor into this too much. But nope, here he is. And I'm a little saddened because Dannyl and Tayend aren't doing super well. This is really like kind of a brave move because they were like the couple that seemed the best matched by the end of the last book. And I kind of came into this fully expecting for them to be like fat and happy together, you know? Instead, what's going on is Tayend is sort of becoming, first of all, he's gotten really involved in something that's called the Secret Club. And it's a bunch of gay men who are acting as if not like everybody doesn't know exactly what the fuck is going on here. They really have this sort of like, this recklessness about people finding out who they are that Dannyl isn't comfortable with. And he judges himself a little for that. He's like, you know, maybe that makes me a coward, but I kind of just want my personal life to like be personal. I'm fine with that. I don't want everybody knowing everything about me, especially because like Kirelia may not be like Sachaka where it's like, you know, you could literally be killed, but it will fucking definitely negatively affect your social status. And I just don't want to deal with this. And Tayend isn't at all worried about Dannyl's feelings on this. Tayend just does what he wants and is kind of inconsiderate to the fact that Dannyl isn't comfortable. And also he has been hanging out more and more with people who are wealthy. So there is this sort of snobbery that is beginning to come out that Dannyl isn't used to seeing in him and does not like. So Dannyl is studying all of these histories, trying to put together and compile a definitive history of magic. And he's going through all of these papers with Lorcan, who's finding himself more and more interested. And there's something also interesting going on with Lorcan, which is he doesn't know what to do with his life. And he feels a little bit of envy that Dannyl does know and has like figured out exactly what he wants to dedicate himself to. And there's a sort of feeling to this that maybe he's putting himself out into this project because he just wants to like be part of a thing. And it's just, you know, at the moment it's interesting and he's just like, let me just go with this, you know? And Dannyl goes over some of the different pieces of history, which are a lot of things that we like learned in the previous books. And there's still like the mystery about some valuable thing that the Eileen gave to us that then disappeared. And also we don't know what happened to that, you know, part of Sachaka that got ruined. All of this stuff. And Dannyl knows that to get more information for this compilation of facts, he really needs to be an ambassador again and be able to go out into the world and interview folks and investigate places himself. But he has not like put in for that position in a long time because he didn't want to leave Tayend. And now he's starting to get to the point that he's like, we're not getting along well. Maybe it would be good for us to like have some time apart. But then there's a voice in his head that's like, yeah, or what if you're away from him and suddenly realize that you don't want this anymore and everything just fucking implodes, which that can happen. You know, we say absence makes the heart grow fonder, but absence can also make you see things more clearly that you don't want to see. So, yeah. This is a really like, I am saddened by the fact that Tayend is going in this direction, but it doesn't feel totally out of the character that we know, you know. I could absolutely see him heading out in this way. So yeah, he's kind of feeling like he's going to put in for ambassador, and he's a little bit gratified at Lorcan's interest in all of this. I think that the idea that they could be partners is like a nice thing that I don't think Danyl's considering what it will look like, that maybe Lorcan is going to be seen as a new, like, love interest to Dannyl. And, you know, there's a giant age difference there, but that doesn't always matter, you know? And yes, the scholar would have to gain permission from the Aline king to go to Sechaka, and it was unlikely that he would be granted it. This is about Tayend. That, you know, it's not just about not wanting to travel with Tayend, but that he probably wouldn't be allowed to go to Sechaka. He wasn't well known or in favor, and partly it was because he was a lad. Sechakan society wasn't as accepting of lads as Aline society was. And he then is sort of like, you know, I might be a lad as well, but people don't know it the way that they know it about Tayend, which is sort of weird. They live together, kind of, you know? I mean, you would think that it would just be as well known, but evidently it's sort of the kind of thing where people are like, if you're willing to be more discreet about it, we will pretend not to know. But we can't do that with Tayend because he clearly kind of wants us to know. And the chapter kind of ends with him being like, yeah, I think I'm going to do this. I think I'm going to head out there. That section ends with that. And then we have Sari meeting with his daughter. And his daughter is a tough little cookie. She, like, his men approach her to bring her to talk to Sari, and she draws a knife in like an instant and is just very prickly and ready to defend herself at the drop of a hat. So at first he like starts to warn her, and she's rolling her eyes and is just like, come on. Oh, really? Somebody wants to kill me. And he has to be like, my literally entire family was murdered last night. Like, you are my last living child. And she sort of stops and is like, oh, okay. And clearly takes it a bit more seriously. And she tells him that she has friends, that she doesn't get into it more than that, but he takes that as, I have people who can protect me. And it's clear that Sari is really struggling with feeling guilty for like not being involved in her life, while also knowing that he did that to protect her and he doesn't really regret it. And he's looking at her at one point, kind of wondering if she understands. And she just like walks out without asking if she can leave, without saying goodbye to him. And that's the end of the chapter. And I really, really like this girl. Ani is like, I'm into her. So I'll be interested to see what happens with that. All right. Well, I think that's it. I'm going to wrap. Thank you very much to Ashleigh for commissioning this episode. There isn't another one coming up anytime soon, so it's probably going to be a while, and hopefully somebody is able to commission it. But, Martin says there's one more, I think. I don't think so, but let me take a look here. But yeah, because I'm really excited to be like back in this part of this world. Let's see, what's today? The 11th? Yeah, today's the last one on the schedule. So we'll see, unless it hasn't been updated, but it's according to the spreadsheet. This is the last one. All right, guys. Well, thank you all again so much for listening. I hope you've been enjoying the show, and I will see you soon with a new episode. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.